UK's weekly World Football Google Hangout. We've got some great guests today. Stan Collymore, former England Aston Villa striker and BR columnist, is with us as usual. Joining us today, Italian football expert Paolo Bandini of The Guardian and other titles. So lucky to have him on board. And our very own Jonathan Johnson. I say our very own Jonathan Johnson, but he writes for ESPN FC and several other titles also. And Jonathan, French football expert and global expert, really. I suppose, Paolo, the same deal. We're going to talk World Cup today. This is a World Cup week, obviously. And I want to start off by just taking a broad sweep at it right now, where we are with the tournament about 9 months away. Who do we see as the most likely teams to win and lift up that trophy at the end of July next year? Let's start with you, Stan.
I think the usual suspects, I'm afraid. I think that Brazil, obviously being hosts, I think that they're going to be travelling around the country. My understanding is that they're not going to be stuck in Rio de Janeiro, that they are going to travel around the country for economic reasons. So without a doubt, Brazil. The talent that they've got, very impressed with Paulinho in the Confed Cup. Neymar is really starting to grow as a world-class player, so you have to have the hosts. Argentina, as always, have talent in abundance. We'll have a huge travelling support and are kind of used to their conditions as well. I've just got the South American group in front of me, and as we stand, we've got Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, and Uruguay, the top 5 teams. Of course, the fifth place team plays in a intercontinental playoff against the Asian group, and that currently could mean Uruguay, so they could miss out. Colombia looking very good. You only have to look at players like Radamel Falcao. Ecuador looking good. So I think that we'll go on, I'm sure, to talk about the Italy, Germany, France, some of the European nations. But I really do think that the mould will continue to be set of a South American team doing very, very well and lifting the trophy in Rio de Janeiro come, a year or so down the line.
Paolo, what's your take on your favourites right now?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with Stan. I think that Brazil certainly have to look at the favourites, and for me, you just have to look at the Confederations Cup. I mean, that Spain team hadn't lost games in competitive tournaments. That's been the thing for so long, and so the way that they won that final 3-0, look, there's circumstances there. Spain had played in that semi-final against Italy. They had a day less rest, they had extra time, they were tired. But I do think, of course, it's a big advantage playing at home for Brazil. I'm interested to see how Germany do in this tournament. I think there's such a hype around their club football at the moment after what happened in the Champions League last year. They've obviously got an extremely talented national team. They're not short of players. So I think Germany are interesting to watch as well. But I mean, again, we are probably, whether it's this small pool of European teams or it's Brazil and Argentina and South America, I think we're probably talking about quite a small group of teams that you can see winning it.
Would you agree with that, Jonathan? Just a small, genuine contenders list, really.
Yeah, I completely agree. I echo Stan and Paolo's thoughts there that Brazil are probably the overriding favourites. I also I'm very curious, like Paolo, to see how Germany do. I think Germany is set up very well, and I think out of the European sides, in my opinion, I think they actually stand the best chance of winning it, more so than perhaps Spain now. I think that the big challenge, the big test for Germany will be to see how Jogi Löw handles his team. I think we saw in the Euros, he arguably defeated himself in that tournament. I think Germany probably should have won it, but with the amount of chopping and changing that Löw did within his team, I think it killed the momentum that the German team have built up, and I'm not sure that we'll see those same changes this time around.
If we look at the qualifying groups as they stand right now, there is a potential that some of the really big hitters and some of the really big hitting players that we're looking forward to seeing might not be there. Paolo, let's go to you on that one. Who do you think is going to be the biggest casualty of qualifying in terms of the tournament next summer?
Well, Stan already touched on Uruguay, and they are in a bit of a iffy spot at the moment. They're, I think, 5 points away from the automatic qualification places. They're in that playoff spot. They're actually, I think, on the same points. I can't remember who it is off the top of my head who's exactly behind them in qualifying.
Venezuela.
Sorry?
Venezuela. They're on the same points.
16
points.
So they're on the same points as Venezuela. They've got one game in hand on Venezuela, I think. So they are a little bit iffy. I think that Mexico as well in CONCACAF aren't as comfortable as they'd like to be. They've gone 6 games through the hexagonal stage, and they've only won 1 game. Now they haven't lost any. They've drawn the rest. But what I think would really worry you if you're Mexico is they've only scored 3 goals in 6 games. Now they've only conceded 2, so you can play that off against it. But I think for a team like Mexico to only score 3 goals in that group is is surprising and going to be worrying them. So I think both of those two teams should be a little bit on edge. And then I guess in Europe, the group that's interesting to me is that group that's got France and Spain in it, because at the moment there's only 1 point between them, and one of them is going to have to go into a playoff. But I think that probably you look at that and think, well, whichever of them does go into a playoff will come out of that okay. So it's not necessarily on the verge of coming out of the competition altogether.
Stan, is there any chance that we could be at the tournament without Cristiano Ronaldo in Portugal, or without Spain or Italy? Is that unthinkable?
Well, just looking at the groups as they stand, I mean, you look Group A, just briefly go through them. Belgium and Croatia looking set fair to qualify from that group. I wouldn't mind having a chat about Belgium, actually, because I think there's a lot of people saying they're dark horses, where I think there's always a nation that goes into a World Cup with great expectations. Spanish teams in years gone by, some of the Soviet Union teams that haven't quite, Serbia, Czech Republic, that when they've actually got there, haven't done as well as a lot of people have expected. So Belgium, a very talented group of players flying at the top of their group, but I wouldn't necessarily, particularly with the conditions in Brazil, it is going to be a toss of a coin. You could end up playing 2 games in conditions that you're used to. It could be wet, it could be fairly miserable in somewhere like Sao Paulo, and then you could go to the north of the country and really struggle in the heat. Group B, Italy and Bulgaria, again, pretty much set fair. I think the Italians play and can really see off the Czech Republic's chances next week, I believe, in Turin. Germany, 5 points clear of Austria, of course, that they play this week. The Dutch, Hungary, Romania, still very tight in that group. I'm surprised that Hungary are there, actually. I mean, talk about England's lack of quality on the global stage. For a country that gave us, the likes of Ferenc Puskás and came to the magnificent Magyars of the 50s, they've never really kicked on from that spell. So it's a really exciting time for them behind the Dutch in Group D. Group E, Switzerland, Albania, looking the 2 likely. Portugal, Russia, Israel, again, 3 points between Russia and Israel in third. I can't foresee for one moment, with the quality that the Portuguese have got, again, a World Cup without Cristiano Ronaldo. So the European groups pretty much are looking set fair. I don't think there are going to be too many shocks. I would just go back to what Paolo said. Looking in the Central American group, there's a cracking last game for Mexico. I think they've got Panama next, and then they've got Costa Rica. They're currently second in the group behind the United States. So it could go down to the last day. And Mexico, as we know, likes the Chicharito, they would take a huge support down to South America. So those could be the casualties. Africa's a very, very interesting one, briefly. South Africa currently being gazumped at the moment at the top of, I think it's Group A in the African section, by Ethiopia. What a fantastic World Cup it would be. We've seen Jamaica go to World Cups. We've seen Trinidad and Tobago. Ethiopia are flying high at this moment in time at the top of their group in Africa. That would be great to see them, after all the strife that they've had over the last 20, 25 years, to be at a World Cup finals tournament.
Jonathan, any fears for you for the big nation, or the supposed big nations that might not make it?
Well, I mean, we've touched on whether France will actually make it, and I have to be honest, I fear for Les Bleus at the moment, solely for the reason that they just don't score goals. We've seen Didier Deschamps putting his faith in the likes of Karim Benzema, a player who hasn't scored in approximately 20 hours of international football. In any other team in world football, Benzema would have been dropped a long time ago, especially when you have a player like Olivier Giroud sitting behind him on the bench, in form at the start of this season for Arsenal. Coming up into these qualifiers, I really expect Deschamps to make a statement and drop Benzema and play Giroud, because if France don't start scoring goals, going into a playoff is not going to be straightforward. I think at the moment they're set up where they could perhaps face Bulgaria. I don't think that will be as easy as it sounds for the French. The French have plenty of talented players, but they're not scoring goals, and although they're not conceding too many, they just don't win enough games under Didier Deschamps at the moment. And I think for me, they're my biggest concern in Europe. I think you also look at the likes of Sweden with Zlatan Ibrahimovic. They look like they might fall out of the reckoning in their group. But I completely agree with the South American qualifying group. It looks like Uruguay are going to face an uphill task there. And I think the situation with Mexico is also quite concerning, particularly when you've got players just deciding that they don't really want to be called up for their nation at the moment. You've got the likes of Guillermo Ochoa, who's turned down a call-up for Mexico at the moment because he's not guaranteed to play in the starting lineup. So I think for them it's a massive concern just how committed some of their players are to getting them to this World Cup.
There are some obvious candidates here. Let's start with you, Paolo. But if we're talking about potential stars of the tournament next summer, run down for me, I mean, maybe some of the obvious names, but also some other players that you think could potentially really catch the eye next summer.
Well, I think the most obvious name, really, I suppose, with it being a home World Cup and his move to Barcelona, I think Neymar is so obvious that it's too obvious, I guess. But he also did, he was the leading scorer in the Confederations Cup, so again, he's the place where lots of people are going to be looking. I think there's some players who are sort of, wouldn't know if they're necessarily under the radar, but maybe aren't as quite as obvious as that. Guys like Paul Pogba at Juventus has been absolutely phenomenal recently. Just the last weekend, absolutely ridiculous reverse pass for Arturo Vidal. He's very quickly gone from being this guy of, well, we're going to find lots of games for him as a squad player at Juventus too. I don't think that when Claudio Marchisio comes back, I don't think Antonio Conte can reasonably drop Pogba anymore. I think he's becoming an absolutely integral part of that Juventus team, and I think that if France are going to get through and if they are going to have a good tournament, he's definitely a part of it. I think Kevin Strootman, the Dutch midfielder, has had a great start to life at Roma. He looks like a really imposing guy and maybe something that Holland haven't always had, a physical and combative player to make that team that's sometimes been a little bit flaky, I guess we'd say, historically, internationally, Holland. I think he can really bring some of that together. And if you're looking for someone who's a little bit less well known, I would have thought to European audiences, I think again, assuming they make it, but I think that Diego Reyes in central defense for Mexico is a tall, really intelligent player who reads the game very well, who sees things and often doesn't even look flashy because he knows where he needs to be and avoids putting himself in situations where he has to do something flashy. And I think that, again, we've talked about Mexico's attacking problems. One of the reasons why they've been so solid at the back is because they've got a guy like him there. I think he's a very interesting player to keep an eye on.
Stan, to you, who are the names that you think when we come to the end of the tournament, we're picking our teams of the tournament, who are the names that we should expect to see in there?
Well, I'd like to see, we're going to pick sort of two branches, if you like, two young players and two players that everybody knows about. We talked about Portugal potentially not qualifying. I think that they will qualify. Wouldn't it be nice at the end of a long European season, we've got all the Champions League football to play and domestic leagues, La Liga in particular, to see Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo go head-to-head and have a great World Cup each and then finally decide who is the world's best player. I mean, ironically, you're probably looking at two players that, certainly at international level recently, haven't been as spectacular, anywhere near as spectacular or as consistent as they have been for their clubs, for example. The Argentinian public still, if you go to Barcelona, if you go anywhere around Europe, Lionel Messi is kind of deified. But the Argentinian public, because he hasn't spent most of his upbringing in Argentina, because they almost see him as a Catalan, the perception is that he hasn't been quite as committed to the cause for Argentina as perhaps other players. So it would be wonderful to see Lionel Messi in South America on the back of another good season, scoring goals, creating chances and putting his show reel, and perhaps even lifting the World Cup. So Messi, Ronaldo, head-to-head. In terms of younger players, I think that pace and physical strength in attacking positions will stand strikers in good stead in this World Cup, quite simply because there are going to be lots of different conditions. There are going to be squads that need to rotate. I'm going to pick out two players that are playing in the Premier League, Romelu Lukaku and Christian Benteke, quite simply because I am an Aston Villa fan. I want Benteke to do well. But Romelu Lukaku obviously now going to Everton, another opportunity to play games. Very, very surprised that he wasn't given an opportunity by Jose Mourinho. I know that they brought Samuel Eto'o in, but I've seen Chelsea already a couple of times this season in the flesh, and certainly giving more output in 20 minutes against Aston Villa, Lukaku, than Bar or Torres had done. And with the likes of Morales, Hazard, Shadley, De Bruyne, Fellaini all behind them creating chances, I think it could be I don't expect them to get very far, and by very far for Belgium, a lot of people are talking potentially finalists or semi-finalists. Perhaps quarter-final would be a realistic expectation. but I do expect one or both of those to be in the shout and scoring goals.
Jonathan, let's have you talk a little bit about Paul Pogba. It was brought up by Paolo there. I know you'll have an insight there. And then if you want to go on to any other players that you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Paul Pogba is going to be one of the players to watch at the World Cup if France get there. The big question for me is just how many of the under-20 World Cup winning players Didier Deschamps elects to actually take with him should they make it there. Because in my opinion, the current generation of players for France are not as good as the kids that are coming through at the moment, and I think there are some cases where those young players should already be usurping some of the senior internationals, and I think Pogba is one of those players who should be coming into the midfield playing regularly. You've also got Geoffrey Kondogbia, who's just moved to Monaco from Sevilla. He's another player that I expect to go on and have a big impact. But I think Paolo's right. Pogba is all of a sudden looking like he's going to become one of Europe's best midfielders. I completely agree with the point of view that Marchisio is going to struggle to get his place back in that team once he returns for a selection. I think Pogba has the potential to go on and be one of the key players in this new look France side that's going to be formed ahead of Euro 2016 on home soil. The only concern I would have for Pogba at the moment is in his early performances for France, he looked absolutely superb in his opening match, but in the second one he got a red card, and I think that discipline is something he's going to have to really keep in check if he wants to make sure that he goes to the World Cup. I don't really think his position is in jeopardy at the moment, but I certainly think that could come into play. As for other stars of the tournament, going back to the 2006 World Cup, we saw how important top quality defenders were when Fabio Cannavaro was voted player of the tournament. In my opinion, I think another similarly superb defender is going to be the difference in winning the World Cup this time around. I think Thiago Silva is going to make a massive difference for Brazil. He is world class. I'm lucky enough to be able to watch him play week in, week out, and I don't think there's any defender in world football that can play with the same authority that he does, and I think that will count for so much for Brazil going into the World Cup. And I also think that players like Marco Reus in the younger, when we're looking at the younger category, is also going to have a big say in the World Cup. I expect Germany to do well, and I think Reus will be an absolutely key part of their plans.
Surprise or no surprise that there wasn't a single English player mentioned there. Let's move on to England under Roy Hodgson and just how are they terrible? Do we go over the top? Paolo, your insight there. Obviously, you're working with the Guardian and around these guys. Do we ask too much of this England team, or are they as bad as you guys seem to make out they are?
Well, I don't know if they're awful. I think we can overstate that too. But I think it is interesting that none of us sort of brought up English players necessarily in the young group of interesting players to watch, because I interviewed Arrigo Sacchi a few years ago, not long after he took over he's taken control of the Italian youth setup. He's in charge of that, and he was talking about expectations for Italy at the time. But he said, look, you can't build a great house without great foundations. If you're only trying to build a little shed, then you can do that, but you can't build something big without having the foundations first, and England are trying to do that. The youth centre is being constructed. That's something that they're aiming for. But right now, you don't see English teams dominating youth tournaments, and I think until you see English teams dominating youth tournaments, then you're not going to see the English team dominating senior tournaments, because there is a correlation there. And Spain have been extremely dominant at youth level recently, at the same time as they're dominating senior tournaments, and at the same time, Italy tend to do well in these tournaments, and they're always showing up at World Cups and European Championships and playing well. I think there is a real link there that England haven't got together at the moment. I don't think Roy Hodgson's got an awful team. I think he's relying, probably a bit much on some players who are getting on a little bit now in Gerrard and Lampard, and who also maybe never quite what we hoped they would anyway, even in their prime. So I think for me, it'd be a pretty unrealistic idea to think that England could win this World Cup, certainly. I think there's too much that needs to go, and I think maybe even Greg Dyke alluded to that when he started talking about the World Cup in 2022 as a more realistic target.
Stan, you've got a column coming later on this, your manifesto for change for England. Just talk a little bit, if you can, about your feeling on England right now, where they're at, what we should expect at the next summer's World Cup, assuming they get there, and then what the future holds, you think?
Well, first there's obviously three out of 4 home games. I'm going to be at Wembley on Friday for the Moldova game. That should be one that England win, despite the fact that, of course, there are several key absences. It remains to be seen how that impacts on the side. Then a very, very tricky game in Kiev. I only just got past them in the Euros last year when I was there watching in the Olympic Stadium. Be a very passionate crowd, and again with depleted resources, can we go there and get the 3 points? Be very difficult. I'll probably take a draw now. Then 2 home games. Montenegro's the last one, who are currently top of the group, of course, and Poland the first one. So with 3 out of 4 home games presented to you, if you can't qualify for a World Cup then, against, with the greatest respect, 3 other nations that are probably not going to get anywhere near the latter stages of a World Cup finals tournament, then you don't deserve to be there. Interesting in terms of the sort of youth link is that English football has never taken seriously. It's almost we've got a kind of craving for the exotic. I mean, I'll expand on it in the column about, what would we rather have? A good young homegrown player that has had resources put into him, we've had a cohesive thought strategy about taking a slice of this huge Premier League pot to put into grassroots, to put into coaching in schools, to put into coaching in football clubs? Or would we rather go and buy Marouane Chamakh? We'd rather go and buy Marouane Chamakh. That's the reality. Oh, have you heard about this exotic Moroccan that's really good? And then he fails. We've paid transfer fees, paid wages, that if we'd have structured the game properly in this country, we always want the top 5 or 10% of players, but there are too many foreign players, and I don't want to sound xenophobic because I'm not, there are too many foreign players that aren't as good as what we've already got coming through academies. So I speak to people like Kenny Swain that had the under-17s group for England that won, I think, the European Championship several years ago, and Noel Blake. The talent is there at 17, 18, 19, doesn't then get into the first team, then ends up in the Championship or Leagues 1 and Leagues 2, and therefore they're not playing and training with the very best players. Clubs want to take off the peg success. I mean, Aston Villa, the club that I support, we bought Joris Akore, the Danish central defender, Antonio Luna, a left-back. Joe Bennett had a very difficult, the young English left-back, tough time last season, but he's got potential. Is that all English clubs are looking at, for their own self-interest, is who can we get in who'll do the job now? And until we have a mechanism, and hopefully Greg Dyke is dealing with this, that says, okay, a slice of this huge pot that keeps on coming in is going to go to put a UEFA coach in schools, so that all of us, if we're all under 8, under 9 players, every single step of our progress as a footballer, we're getting proper tuition. And then, as English or British-based players, we don't make it as professional footballers. Hey, we live in these islands, we might be journalists and put back into the game, we might be coaches, we might be referees, we might be administrators. English football always takes the easy option rather than looking at the long game, in my opinion.
Jonathan, let's hear your perspective, and also if you have a sense of the external view on what people see as the England national team and the problems with it right now.
I completely agree with Stan. I don't think there's enough emphasis on the youth that's coming through. I don't think it's taken seriously enough when the talent is there. I also think, though, that, and looking at it from the outside, I just think that expectations are simply far too high. I think that every time we go into a major tournament, the English media, the English fans are expecting the team to, really turn up trees to get to the quarterfinals, the semi-finals, the final. Okay, maybe arguably the quarterfinals is a realistic objective for England, but I don't think a semi-final or a final has been a realistic objective for England since the real early days of the golden generation. Once it became obvious that there was this sort of choking every time they got to these major tournaments, then I think that these expectations that England were going to bring home the first World Cup since 1966 have become very unrealistic, and that pressure reflects on the players and they feel it. And every time there's a negative result, and I say this because it's very similar in France, every time there is a negative result for the national team, instead of there being sort of a groundswell of support so that the team recover from it, there's a lot of criticising. Some players are savage. There's always a scapegoat for these poor results, and I think that for a long time now, England have lacked certain quality in certain positions, and I think really what's going to hold them back going into next year's World Cup, if they get there, will be the lack of a real goal scorer. But I think if youth football had been taken seriously enough, then I think that we would be seeing young players getting a chance at international level. I know Stan will be delighted to find out that I'm a Villa fan as well, and I was very disappointed when Nathan D'Alfonso was sort of cast out. Really, he had a few chances under Martin O'Neill to really sort of kick onto this reputation that he developed at youth level and for Villa and for England, and then was never really given the chances at senior level because Villa were looking for somebody who was able to do the job now. They didn't have an eye on the future, and now arguably his international chances, certainly at senior level, are almost non-existent.
It's a very good point actually about Nathan D'Alfonso, because I remember him coming on. I think it was against Ajax it was either the last season of the UEFA Cup or early Europa League, probably UEFA Cup now. Cocky, confident, talking to other players, very good communication skills. This was a young rookie, and then obviously, like I say, his development has been hampered. Spoke to Brendan Rodgers the other week talking about Daniel Sturridge. Daniel Sturridge, again, the problem with the Premier League starts at Manchester City. Doesn't really play many games. Rumours of him wanting lots and lots of money to stay there. Gets punted onto Chelsea. Doesn't play many games for Chelsea. Finally grasps the nettle, goes to Liverpool where he's got an arm round him. He's playing around him with good players. Luis Suarez, when he comes back into the side, scoring goals, and he looks the most likely. But his progress could have been accelerated by 2 or 3 years by just playing football. And this is what the point I'm going back to. Is that we all say England haven't got a chance, therefore it becomes let's buy lots of foreign players to bring into the Premier League. I'm not talking about the very best, I'm talking about Category B, Category C, Category D players. That in an island of 60 million people, if you're taking Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, that they're out there playing football. It's ridiculous to assume that there isn't somebody as good as Marouane Chamakh playing football at this moment in time. And I'm sorry to use Marouane Chamakh, sorry Marouane. But that they aren't out there. But Schillaci, I wrote in the column, which is going to go out shortly. Schillaci, Arsenal sold. Is there a better central defender? Probably kicking around at 18, 19 in the UK now. Yes, there probably is. People like Bebe, that's just gone back I think he's gone back to Portugal, Manchester United. Anderson. There are a number of players that we all like to get into our club and are the next big thing that are hampering the progress of players that play in a football mad nation. 60 million people, we all love football, the talent is out there, we just need to have a little bit of patience with them when it comes to getting around academies. And the link, I completely agree, of the point about English youth football, is that we need, when we develop talent at 16, 17, 18, they've got to be given their opportunities in their first teams in the Premier League and in the Championship. Otherwise, they're just going to get lost to the game.
We've lost. Looks like we've lost Paolo for a minute there. But let's just finally then, Jonathan, on that point, are there systems working in other countries right now that England ought to be trying to duplicate effectively?
Well, I think you just have to look at the success France has, for instance, in being able to bring through young players. I know that it's not always translated into a senior level, but at the moment they look like they're about to hit gold with the Under-20 World Cup win. The Under-19s also did fantastically well in the European Championship, and there's a very promising crop of young players coming through there. And the reason that these players can come through with such regularity is because France put an emphasis on youth development a long time ago, developed the Clairefontaine Academy, which is worth its weight in gold, because every player that comes through there gets the same fundamental education, and then they go and develop from there. And because the French teams up until now haven't really had the same amount of money to spend as a lot of their European rivals, they've had to develop talent. And you look at the Dutch teams, you look at the Belgian teams. Belgium has a fantastic national team now because they've had to put emphasis on their youth academies, because they simply don't have the money to compete with their other European rivals. The Dutch have done it for a long time, and nobody's better at bringing through young players than Ajax, it seems, apart from maybe Barcelona. And I think that in France, the long-term benefits of Clairefontaine are massive, and I think for English football to have a centre of excellence like Clairefontaine would be a massive step forward going into the future.
Paolo, you're back. I wanted to ask you one more question. We were talking about the development in all of these countries with players. Is there anything that you see having, in your writing about the NFL and American sports, is there anything that we ought to be adopting from American sports culture in the development of young players in terms of English football? I think you might be on mute. Can you hear us, Paolo?
Yes, I can hear you. My bad.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead with your answer there on US sports. Anything that we should be learning from there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. First of all, the absence. Had a big power cut here. I don't know what happened, but all the lights went out. I don't know if there is an awful lot that can be taken from American sports because it's a very different structure, and I think there's actually a lot of unhealthiness in the American structure. You have this big college system which players, their natural progress to a professional sport is to study at high school and play for their high school team. Then they get a scholarship to go to a college, a university, and play there for several years, and that's all paid for. And then they go on to the pros, and maybe it works well for something like the NFL for American football because simply the physicality of the senior league, and maybe it's good to have an interim step there for guys who are 18 to 21 rather than going and playing with guys who are fully physically developed and who can damage them. But actually, what's interesting is in the football leagues over here, the soccer leagues, they have the same setup at the moment where they have a college system and they have a draft every year where professional teams in Major League Soccer get to select the players who have been playing college. And I've spoken to a lot of people now within the US soccer system who really aren't thrilled with that system, who really don't think it works them very well. They think that they would be much better off developing their own youth academies where they can get players at a higher level of competition sooner because they think the college level keeps players playing against players who aren't of a high enough caliber up to an age of 21, 22, by which point they've already lost a lot of great years of development where these professional teams think they could do a better job at a younger age. So, no, I don't think there is an awful lot to take from the American system necessarily. I don't know how much you were talking about these sorts of things while I was out. I was actually going to jump in and say something about the way things work in Italy just before I lost the connection, which is, some of the very similar problems. Young players are not given a chance for top Serie A teams. In fact, I'd say Italy is much more mistrustful of youth than England is. Guys don't generally get chances in Serie A teams until they're 23, 24 years old. But what you have got is this co-ownership system where the bigger teams will, rather than loaning a player out, they'll sell him on co-ownership to a smaller team, which is, without going into all the details, effectively means that both teams have a half share, and if the bigger team wants the player back, they're going to have to pay the smaller team to get him back. And I think that model maybe works in some extent because the smaller teams then have an incentive to develop the player. If you get someone on loan, he's only really of use to you as long as he can help you win games straight away. If you're a smaller team with a player on co-ownership, you have a financial stake in that player. And so it's in your interest to make him a better player and then sell him back to the team who even if you can't keep him, you sell him back to the team who sold him to you on co-ownership for a profit, and you get something out of it. So I wonder if that model is another good reason, is another good model, I guess, for Italian teams in the development of young players.
Paolo, thanks very much. I think that's probably our lot, guys. We've run to the sort of 30-minute mark. So I wanted to thank Stan Collymore, Paolo Bandini, and also Jonathan Johnson for being with us today. We'll be back with another episode, Stan and I, with a couple of more guests next Friday. So thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.